Mumta Ito began her career as a high-powered corporate lawyer working in the heart of the city of London, Britain's equivalent to Wall Street. She was advising investment banks, multinational corporations, and governments on large-scale complex transactions. She was very successful until she found herself questioning the human value of her work. During a leave of absence, she experienced a profound spiritual transformation and joined the entourage of Amma, one of India's foremost teachers, healers, and humanitarians. Using her legal training to serve her new spiritual consciousness, she set up a successful environmental organization in the Virgin Islands, which led her to challenge the whole relationship between human law and the laws of nature. She founded the International Centre for Wholistic Law in Scotland, and she's now engaged in a European citizens' initiative designed to change the world by embedding the rights of Mother Earth in the legal system of the 28-nation European Union.
In the EU, we've had participatory democracy as a fairly new invention. Started in February 2011 with the European Citizens Initiative. And what the European Citizens Initiative allows us to do in Europe is that 7 citizens from 7 member states can propose a law to the European Commission. And provided we raise at least 1 million signatures across at least 7 member states with a de minimis of about 0.01% of the population of at least 7 countries, then the European Commission have to consider passing that law.
Wow. But that's a big task. That's 7 countries and well, I guess several million signatures if you've got to get to that percentage of the population.
That's right. And what makes it really helpful for citizens is that the European Union allows us to collect signatures online. And so we can run it as an online petition campaign, use social media and all of the rest.
And there are 20 other countries, right? And you can also take action in those, but separately or individually.
Absolutely. We intend to run the initiative for the rights of nature across all 27 countries. And the way we're organizing, we're going to have a central team, and we're also going to have country teams that are going to be actively spreading the message in all of the countries.
Now, what's the initiative? Tell me what it is that you're trying to do with all this.
Okay. Basically, what we're looking to do, it's well known that we are facing unprecedented environmental issues. And in my experience as an environmental lawyer, I can see that the current system of environmental law that we have, which is pretty much based on a paradigm of nature as property, restricts citizens to having to bring cases through the planning and the administrative courts. And so it's very difficult for communities to protect nature per se. So the initiative that we're bringing is following the emerging paradigm that's appearing throughout the world in countries like Ecuador and Bolivia, in municipalities throughout the United States, of recognizing a natural law approach, so recognizing nature's inherent rights to thrive and to flourish. So our European Citizens Initiative is for recognizing and respecting the inherent rights of nature.
Mm-hmm. Now, what would that actually mean in practice? I mean, let's say I'm a citizen of one of the countries in the European Union, and I see some environmental outrage going on, which I'm sure it does, you know. What can I do about it?
Right, so assuming that our initiative was successful and the EU adopted a directive on the rights of nature, what that would mean is that the EU, once they've adopted the directive, it would become applicable in all 27 member states. So there will be a time period within which each member state will have to enact laws that, that give effect to the principles in the directive. So this would enable the ordinary citizen in a European country to invoke the rights of nature. So it would take it outside of the property paradigm. In conjunction with just giving nature rights, of course, we've got to look at mechanisms. And at the moment, the current mechanism of looking at environmental cases is through the planning and administrative courts. And there is also a movement to bring about an international court for the environment. And so, coupled with our initiative, we would also like to build in this mechanism so that citizens have a much more straightforward means of addressing these issues.
Can you think of an example of something which you can't now address, but would at least get its day in court, if this were in place? Right?
Yes. For example, something like fracking. At the moment, communities need to look at the planning laws and need to look at the actual permissions that are given to do extensive environmental assessments and all of these things. And it's very difficult for communities to actually bring a case. Usually you would need to show that your rights are personally affected in some sort of a way. If it were the rights of nature, we'd be able to look at the rights of the ecosystems that would be destroyed by this, as well as the rights of the human beings involved. And if we had a court for the environment, it would give a completely different avenue for which to look at these issues.
Okay, so if I were a citizen, I were trying to take some action on, let's say, the pollution of the local river or something of that kind, if I go now, I have to show that that pollution affects me personally and directly in order to have what they call standing, right?
Yes, exactly. Usually this is the case. And this makes it extremely difficult. Yeah. No.
So, but in this situation, once you have that kind of legislation in place, then it becomes possible for me to go to court and say, it doesn't directly affect me, but it does affect nature, and it does,
yes, part of the mechanism that we look to build in is also to give community the rights to defend the rights of ecosystems and of nature. And at the moment, rights of communities are not really recognized in our legal system per se. Yes, there may be pockets where this exists, but it isn't really a given. And certainly not being able to speak up on behalf of ecosystems and biodiversity that is affected by human action.
And it's in the States, they're taking that as the approach to try and get this kind of change, is to say the community itself seizes that jurisdiction, basically says within our city, within our town, nature has rights, and then the hope is that this becomes a big enough movement that it eventually pushes upward. But you're looking at, in a sense, almost the opposite direction, right? Doing it across this large political structure.
Yes. In the United States, it's my understanding that municipalities are able to create their own ordinances. In European countries, well, in particularly the UK, which is where I'm from, this is not really an avenue that's available to us. If laws were made at the local level, they could be overridden at levels further up. So even if communities got together and they declared that we want to have a charter that recognizes the rights of nature, those rights would not really be upheld in court. So another difficulty that we have with Europe is that the laws of each country are different. So if we had a ground-up movement in Germany, it doesn't mean that it would inspire a similar movement in Spain, because it would be a different legal framework. It's not as if they could just take what's happened in Germany and just apply it to Spain. So by going at the European level, it provides an incredibly efficient mechanism for bringing about change throughout the whole of the European Union, because by proposing a framework directive, we can propose a framework that brings in a legal structure that actually enables sustainability, and if that is adopted, it will have to be legislated for in all of the individual countries. So yeah, so as far as I know, in the United States, they also don't have an efficient participatory democracy that would make a proposal immediately applicable across all states. So this is something quite unique that we have in Europe, which is very exciting for us as citizens to take advantage of.
Yeah. Now, you also, you mentioned there's a sort of a paradigm about the organization, just to come back to that for a few moments. And what did you call it? Systemic progression or something like that?
Right. I'm the founder of an organization called the International Centre for Wholistic Law, and we're based in the Findhorn Foundation community in Scotland. Our vision at the Centre for Wholistic Law is a world in which human laws and legal practice were in alignment with the universal laws that govern all of life. So if human laws are that which regulate human behavior and human relationships, then it naturally flows from that it needs to take into account all of the relationships that humans have. And at the moment, our legal systems really only take into account relationships between rights holders, which are, broadly speaking, human beings and other entities that have been created by human beings, like corporations, ignoring the most fundamental relationship that human beings have, which is our relationship with the natural world.
So the Center for Holistic Law will try to encourage an alignment between the existing legal system and the laws of nature that you really can't offend, right?
Yes, absolutely. And we're also very much, part of our work at the International Centre for Holistic Law is looking at ways of resolving disputes that go beyond blame, that go beyond separation. So looking at the wider issues that affect all of us. Legal disputes are usually stemmed in societal problems, and they cannot be looked at in isolation. And so we're pioneering also innovative methods of dispute resolution that allow the voices of all the stakeholders to be heard and taken into consideration.
So this is a whole different legal process, isn't it? I mean, it's not the adversarial process. It's a process of finding solutions with many participants.
That's right. Our current legal system is based on a paradigm of retribution. And as you know, when we look at relationships, if I'm having a dispute with my friend and I'm seeking retribution, it's not really going to advance things in a positive way. So on a similar vein, we have certain practices that take us towards war, and we have certain practices that take us towards peace, certain practices that unite us and certain practices that separate us. And so we're seeking to use law as a tool to unite us and to bring restoration, reparation, and healing rather than retribution.
Let me take you back to the beginning of all of this, because one of the things I find fascinating about your story is that it begins in, of all places, the financial heart of London, the city of London, the very belly of the beast. And how did you get from there to Findhorn and holistic law?
Right. Yes. It was an interesting journey, and yes, I did start out, in the so-called belly of the beast, or as what some people may see as part of the problem. I was a structured finance lawyer. I worked in the City of London. I used to represent investment banks, governments, large multinationals on very big transactions that involved several jurisdictions, etc. A lot of complex work. And I found that this was, on the outside it was going very well, but in my inner world something was not quite sitting right. And one day I had a profound spiritual awakening, and literally overnight my worldview changed. And so when I went back into the office, nothing there resonated with me anymore. Everything was back to front, it was inside out, nothing really made sense. I found that the work that I was doing was not really in alignment with what I really valued in this world. And so I came out of there, and I started to pursue a deeper inquiry. I started to pursue a path of healing, and spiritual practice, and I trained with some of the most profound spiritual teachers of our time.
Now, what was the spiritual experience that turned this over? Because this is a fascinating situation where one day you're more or less aligned with what you're doing, and then suddenly it's gone completely out of harmony. Right?
Yes. Well, okay. I was raised in a fairly spiritual environment. I'd grown up practicing yoga and meditation, and had been brought up in the spiritual traditions of my ancestors. And there came a time when I wanted to turn away from that and really experience what the mainstream of life was saying was the route to happiness. And this led to me pursuing the career path that I did, and I pursued it wholeheartedly. And so one day when my father wanted to go and visit Mother Mira, who's an enlightened being who's residing in Germany, invited me and my husband to come with him, I was really not very interested. At that point, I'd convinced myself that there is nothing spiritual in this world. It's just a scientific, material world, and you know, and that's pretty much what life is all about. And she's probably a fake, and it's nothing of interest to me. However, the reason that my father was going was because my sister was actually very ill at the time, and he wanted to take her for healing. And my sister was refusing to go. So my father pleaded with me, and he said, well, if everybody comes, at least I can say to your sister that it's a family holiday, and you know, you don't even need to come and see Mother Mira. You could just hang out. So I thought, okay, well, I'm not interested in going to see Mother Mira, but I'm interested in helping my sister. So if it would be of help to her, then I'll come along. And of course, once I got there, I couldn't resist going to see Mother Mira.
Yeah,
so,
who is this person?
So I went, and when I walked into the hall, Mother Mira has two assistants, and they balance the energies in the room by adjusting the seating between people. So, you know, they would sometimes move people, ask people to sit in certain positions. So I walked into the room, and as soon as I walked into the room, the assistant motioned to me and my husband and asked us to sit on a seat right in front of Mother. And my initial thought at the time was, wow, they're very hospitable to skeptical people. And then when my father and my mother and my sister walked in, they motioned for them to sit on the side. And then I thought, oh, wait a minute, there might be something more to this, because she's ill. So anyway, Mother Mira came into the room, and I went into a deep meditation. All of my, you know, my childhood upbringing and my deep reverence for the spiritual came back to me as soon as I was in the presence of this incredible being. And I received Mother Mira's blessing, which she does in a very particular way. She works with the central channel, she says, where certain karmic codes are encoded, and they appear in the form of knots. And she looks directly for about 6 seconds into the eyes of each person. And when she does that, she's unknotting these knots within the central channel. So after the session that night, I had the most incredible sleep. And during that sleep, I found that I was having these dreams where I was held by these incredibly beautiful swirling colors, which I later found a book of paintings by Mother Mira where she was describing other dimensions of reality. And in these paintings, she had these incredibly beautiful swirling colors, a bit like I'd seen in my dream. So anyway, I came out of there and I came back to the office, and it was like the show was over. What am I doing here? I thought.
And how did your colleagues react? Because you then basically, your body was there, but you had spiritually left the building, right?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the first changes that I made was that I turned my desk around because I had a beautiful view of the sky and I wanted to be a little bit more connected to nature and what was going on in the world. And in my job, we used to work incredible hours. Working all through the night through to the next day was quite common. You know, leaving the office at 3 a.m. It was commonplace. So we never really got to go outside. So I turned my desk around to look at the sky and I started playing subliminal, relaxing music in my room. And people used to come into the office and all of a sudden they would just forget what it was that they'd come to talk about. And they would say, wow, I feel really nice. And then they'd start talking about, you know, something personal. And after a short time, my room became known as the love room. So, yeah. And there was, you know, coming to how I managed to, you know, to come away from that period of work, the pain of being in that environment got more and more intense for me. And one day when I was there late at night working on a transaction, I ended up having a heart-to-heart with my boss, you know, saying, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this to ourselves? What's the end result of what we do? Some corporation or some bank just ends up making a little bit more money. And what are they doing with the money? Are they solving the problems of poverty in the world? No, they're not. They're investing it in things that sometimes can be causing damage. And I don't really know why I'm doing this. And so my boss said, well, why don't you leave? And I said, well, I can't leave because I'm in this situation where we're building a house and, you know, I just don't know what to do. And he said, well, something in him really heard me. And he said, well, how about we structure it as a redundancy? You know, maybe you could I could give you, say, a year and a half's pay, and that would give you an opportunity to finish building your house, and by then you'd discover what it is that you really want to do. Personally, I think once you've gone out there and seen what it's like out there, you'll know how good it is here and you'll be back here. But, you know, how about it? And I thought, wow, this is fabulous. So I took it, and I haven't turned back.
Have you seen him since?
No, I haven't.
I'm just curious to know what he would think about it.
Yeah, it would be very interesting. Actually, I would like to see him one of these days.
He sounds like somebody that's got some spark.
I got on fabulously with him. He was a great guy. And yeah, and so from there, you know, it gave me the opportunity to really deepen my spiritual practice, and I started traveling with my spiritual teacher and really going intensely into on the spiritual path. And it was during that time that at the back of my mind, even though, you know, the world of healing and the world of spirituality was absorbing me so completely and so bringing me so much fulfillment, I really wondered why it was that I'd been trained to the nth degree in something that that was now utterly irrelevant to me. I could see that the way law was structured, it was entrenching the victim-perpetrator paradigm in our society, and I really wondered how we could bring about peace through methods that are primarily based on war. So I asked my spiritual teacher whether I ought to continue in some way looking at being able to use the law in order to serve humanity, or whether to just abandon that idea completely and focus on something else. And what she said to me was very simple. She said, stay in law for now, and when the opportunity comes to serve, just take it. So about a week later, I found myself in the Virgin Islands, and I was approached by somebody on the island saying that the government had recently given approval for a golf course and a 5-star hotel in an area of international ecological importance. In fact, a protected area with a Ramsar code and internationally recognized as a protected area. Even though there had been debates for years and years and lots of environmental studies, finally the chief minister had just unilaterally given his consent. So the chief conservation officer was tearing his hair out because he wanted to bring a case, but no lawyers on the island would help him. It was the kind of island, it was a small island, everybody knew each other, and so there are a lot of complex interrelationships between the people. Nobody would dare go against the government, and in this scenario you'd have to go against the chief minister personally, and the chief minister was the guy who personally would have to sign all the work permits and all the business permits of the lawyers. So yeah, so understandably very few lawyers were interested in taking it up. So I thought to myself, okay, when the opportunity comes to serve, just take it. And so I went to go and see him, and we had a discussion. We had 3 weeks to file a case. I had no knowledge of environmental law. I thought, okay, let's do it. So the first port of call for me was to start working on the energy with the spiritual practices and the healing practices that I had learned. And as soon as I started to do that, I found that miracles started to happen. Within the time, 3 weeks, which is a very short time space, to amass all of the evidence that would be necessary to bring a challenge, everything just came, and we were in a position to file the case. At this point, it wasn't even clear whether citizens would even have standing, because no environmental cases had ever been brought in this particular jurisdiction. And so we organized as an NGO. There was one Caribbean case where the citizens had gotten standing, and that was only because it was brought by an organization with an international reputation and, you know, the scientific knowledge and all of that. It was Greenpeace that brought this case. So we thought, okay, we'll form the Virgin Islands Environmental Council, and we got hold of whatever scientific experts that we could and prominent people that we could find in the community to come on board with this NGO. It was very difficult to get somebody prominent from the community to sign their name behind the case, and it had to be somebody personally bringing the case. But eventually a prominent man in the community stepped forward, and we filed. So what happened as a result of this? At that time, I was still volunteering and touring and studying with my spiritual teacher. And so as soon as we filed the case, I was off the island and I was on tour in Europe. So I discovered a new way of doing law. We were in a new city every 2 to 3 days, and I was working from morning till night in the organization of my spiritual teacher running these programs. And so I really didn't know where I was going to find the time or the space. I had no idea whether I'd have internet connection, how I'd be able to get hold of people, when the hearings were going to be, and I thought this would be very interesting. But what I found was that all I had to do was stand as a channel for grace. And I found that the case was doing itself. Miraculously, whenever anything needed to be responded to, or any business needed to be transacted, I'd find that I would have internet connection. All of the people that I needed to connect with would be online at that time. We'd transact our business in incredibly efficient time, and then I'd be back with my spiritual teacher. And this was a completely new experience to me, because working in a law firm, I was used to the, you know, you would push and push and push and push and, you know, be like working on it, working on it, working on it, even though in reality, things only move in a very prescribed way. So when I started to notice that there was an orchestration and a timing that was beyond my control. And all I had to do was to be incredibly present to what was actually unfolding, and to be a conduit for the energy to facilitate the process. So the outcome of all of this, I mean, launching the case was very useful. Even though, yes, it was engaging in the adversarial process, it was useful because it stopped work from starting. It stopped the diggers from going in. And the first fortunate thing that happened in the chain was that the developers' funding got pulled as a result of the case. So that bought us time. However, we thought it was going to be a quick process, which was part of the reason that I was prompted to take it on. It was going to be a judicial review, and in the legislation it said you get a result in 3 months. It took us 3 years because the developers joined the action, and they kept stalling it. So they kept applying for these, extensions, and it just kept getting pushed back and further back. By this time, we had a legal team, and the people on the island started to feel more empowered. Initially, it was the kind of place where people felt very disempowered because the government ran the shots and they really didn't have a voice. But somehow, launching this case really kind of caught the imagination of the people. And so we worked on many different levels. Because people were highly interrelated and they knew each other, we started working with dialogues, with building relationships, with rallying around the shared values. So this is where we started working in a non-adversarial way, showing that actually, by preserving what we have in terms of our biodiversity and preserving nature, we're actually building a much richer future for our countries and for future generations. And the government started to change their view on things, so much so that by the time our court case came to be heard, in the government's national tourist brochure, they were actually bragging that they're such an environmentally friendly nation that we even have, a local group that are challenging the government in court on environmental grounds. So anyway, we won at first instance. Of course, because we were restricted to the planning and administrative courts, we had to find fault with the planning process. So we went for every single angle that we could get. What the judge found was that development couldn't happen, so we won purely on the basis that it was a protected area and it was prohibited by law for any development to happen there. So that was great. However, the developers did appeal, and the appeal was carried out in St. Lucia. And on appeal, we weren't so fortunate because the St. Lucian judge decided to go with the developers, who were putting forward an argument that there was a technical drafting error in the way the law had been created. Instead of calling it a fisheries protected area, they referred to it as a marine protected area. And so in actual fact, the judge says, well, the area is not protected, even though there have been all these environmental studies, and there was actually no dispute in the planning process about the protected status of this area. The judge still ruled that actually it's not protected, and so the development can go ahead. However, and this is the beauty of this case, the government had such a change of heart in the way they were perceiving the issue that they came forward and they said, okay, well, we'll just change the law. The planning permission had lapsed. We'll change the law and we'll word it as the judge wants it. And on top of that, we'll declare the area a national park. So, I mean, anybody who's had any experience of trying to bring environmental cases in the public interest would know that this is an absolutely phenomenal result. Usually, if the government had still retained the same posture and we'd say we'd have won at court. At the very best, all we would have won is that the decision would go back to the planners, the developers would make one or two changes and to get around what the judge said, and then usually the development goes ahead in some shape or form. So this was an absolutely astounding result. So after that, I came to the conclusion that, okay, I've got my learnings in law. I can see that this adversarial process, you know, it doesn't work and it's not for me. And that's great. If all changes happen fundamentally at the energy level, and I'll just continue focusing on that.
You know, the most striking thing to me about that story is that because your vision is at a level above the adversarial nature, like the normal lawyer would take this on and would never question that framework. They'd just work within it in an adversarial way, but you're coming at it in a sort of a problem-solving way, in a much more open kind of way. And then it sounds as though you, I don't know how much by design and how much by just evolution it was, but it sounds as though you basically had a whole educational process that went on that finally affected the government. And it's really it's a fascinating story, because in a sense what I'm hearing is, so we bought a little time and that gave people a chance to think, and then we got another little bit of time and that gave other people a chance to think, and as they thought more about it, the people in the government started to think about it, and it evolves in a very non-adversarial way, even though it's an adversarial process. But it uses the law as a kind of a learning process for the entire community.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And this is the beauty of taking a holistic approach.
Yeah. The other thing that strikes me is in that story is the remarkable experience with Mother in Germany, because you go into that. I mean, at one level, if you had been, you know, very much in a spiritual path in the first place, it would be less. Well, you might never have been in the law firm, I guess, but you go in there with no expectation of change. You've got the sort of the foundational understanding of the situation, but you go in there basically to convenience your father, and and to do something for your sister, and the idea that anything is going to change for Mumta is not on the agenda at all. And then you have this profound experience, bingo, and you come out into a different world. But the striking thing for me is, if you were ready for that, you didn't know it. Right?
Absolutely. In fact, the person who was leading the tour, taking people to see Mother Mira, she sat us down and she said, people sometimes they undergo profound change. Sometimes their lives fall apart. If their relationships are not aligned, sometimes their relationships fall apart. If their work is not aligned, they find their work falls apart. And I thought, there's absolutely no way on earth that anything is going to fall apart in my life.
And then it does.
Yeah, and then the whole thing fell apart.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely fascinating.
Fascinating. Mm.
So let me come back to Europe, because I can see the sort of evolution of how you get to the point where you're thinking very differently, but you're also feeling very empowered, right? I mean, because essentially you're starting a movement here to change the legal system with 27 countries. Right?
Well, absolutely, and again, there's a little bit of a story of how I came into that. It wasn't that one day I woke up and I thought, you know what, we've got this initiative and I'm going to do something about it. It was a little bit of an evolutionary process. After the Virgin Islands case, I thought, right, well, that's it. I don't need to do anything further with law. I'm clear. I'm just going to continue on my path of healing. And I became a mom, and our family, me and my husband and my daughter, we went up to go and live in the Findhorn community in Scotland. And it was around that time when I had a minor physical issue, and I went to a kinesiology session. Kinesiology is a way of testing the muscles to see whether something is true or not true, and it's a way of bypassing the mind and going into the body intelligence. And very usually they would test the muscles to see if you're allergic to certain foods and that sort of thing, but they could test a whole variety of issues. So I went for a kinesiology session about this minor physical issue. And what came out of the session was that I need to put together a project that brings law and healing together, that shifts the whole paradigm of the legal profession from adversarial to a paradigm of healing, restoration, reparation, and that takes into account the rights of all beings. And in order to know more fully what I should do, that I should do a series of meditations, an extra 2 hours of meditation, and I was already doing about 3 hours of meditation a day anyway. So an extra 2 hours of meditation, sending healing to the legal profession every day for a month, during which time I'd get more clarity. And I did that, at first very disbelievingly, and you know, and very much dismayed, thinking, oh, I thought maybe I could avoid certain foods, and that would be all I'd need to do. Yeah, so I was sort of a little bit skeptical when I went into these meditations that anything would come, but amazingly, a lot of information, a lot of clarity came through. And so I would sit there each day with a notepad and jot down all the insights that came to me. And that culminated in the creation of the International Center for Wholistic Law. And for our inaugural event, one of the things that we're trying to pioneer is the use of systemic constellations in the context of legal disputes. Systemic constellations are a method that a man called Bert Hellinger from Germany developed in the context of families, which completely revolutionized the way psychology operates. And it's pretty much been incorporated into the mainstream in Germany. He got his insights when he was living in Africa, and he observed how the tribal people dealt with their disputes and issues, and how a lot of issues that people were carrying in the present had their origins with previous generations and unresolved energy from previous generations that continued to perpetuate itself.
You mean like our parents were enemies, so we're enemies? That kind of thing?
Yeah, that kind of thing. But it could
trust
be
those guys? Right?
It could be not even as specific as that. It could be something like if our parents were, or our grandparents were enemies with a person because of a certain thing, we could be carrying an aspect of that, and so we may be enemies with somebody completely unrelated to who our parents were enemies with, but the same dynamic is playing out that played out in a previous generation. And so he devised this method of working with representatives and found that a phenomena started to appear where representatives who had absolutely no idea or had never met people whose issue it was and had no idea about their family system, when they were standing as a representative and asked just to be present to what was occurring in their body, would be downloading information relating to that system that ordinarily they would not know. So somehow people were tapping into this collective consciousness, and dynamics, hidden dynamics, would become immediately visible. And he found that when things were acknowledged, this had a healing effect upon the whole system. So things that were excluded, when they were included again, this then brought balance. And he created something which was called the Orders of Love, which was an alignment of order that brought about peace and harmony, which basically is, you know, in harmony with the natural laws that that govern all of life. So at our inaugural event, we used systemic constellations to look at, we had a group come from Falkirk, a community that were facing fracking in their community, to look at the issues related to that. And we also did a constellation about the field of holistic law and where a change agent would be most effective. For the fracking case, it was quite evident that the community group were quite burnt out, and they really didn't know where to go next. They felt that They were feeling angry, and they felt as if they were locked in this battle that they were not going to win with the energy company, and they wanted some practical, pragmatic answers. And at the end of the constellation, the man who brought the issue, who was one of the leaders of the campaign, said that he could see immediately that how he'd become embroiled in this battle with the energy company, but the energy company were just part of a much wider systemic picture, and that really what we're up against is ourselves. And he could also see how personally, how the energy company were bound to the people that it was serving, and how he was also, by virtue of being a human being, also interconnected with that, and he found it difficult to reconcile that on a personal level. He also found that during the constellation, the representative for energy had to leave the room 3 times to be sick. So, yeah, and she wasn't feeling sick before or after the constellation. So there was a lot of energy that got moved during that. And at the end of that constellation, it ended up with the position of the energy company becoming a lot more balanced, and the position of the citizens group becoming reconnected with the original impulse that brought them to the work, and then being strengthened. And after this constellation, the person who brought the issue said that he felt as a result of it that his consciousness had expanded, and he can now see the need to work on multiple levels and multiple dimensions, and that it's not just a one-dimensional battle against one company, but a much broader systemic issue. And from that, they ended up getting they launched a signature. They already had a signature campaign, but they managed to get an unprecedented number of signatures, which won them a public inquiry, which is going to be coming up. And they were also invited to a conference with the Scottish National Party, which is looking at banning fracking in the whole of Scotland. So somehow the movement did, get a new direction, new life.
Well, it's another one of these ones where you've got a very specific situation, and somehow, if you I hate to say rise above it, but in a sense step back or look at it in a more rounded way, opportunities arise that you wouldn't have seen if you'd stayed in that locked-in battle. Eh?
Absolutely. And with coming back to the European Citizens Initiative, with Wholistic Law, what we found was that Holistic Law didn't really have a place until all beings appeared on the scene. And it was when all beings, or a consideration of all beings, were included in the framework, it was at that point that the mainstream adversarial system really didn't know how to deal with the situation, but Holistic Law was there in its entirety to meet it. And from that, I just got the clear insight that the rights of nature is something that would really bring about the change, the systemic change that we need to evolve our legal systems to really meet the challenges that we're all facing globally today. And from that, I learned about the ECI, and I thought, well, it's obvious. We'll bring a European Citizens Initiative to get the rights of nature recognized in Europe.
If I can tease out one little thing there that strikes me as interesting, is when you say that when you mention all beings, in a sense that's what the rights of nature does, isn't it? Is that it expands your sense of the community that has standing and has rights and whose interests need to be considered and have legitimately need to be considered. It expands that from humans and human structures to the entire Earth community.
Absolutely.
And so that changes you're not just changing the rules, you're changing the definition of who the courts should be serving and what the community is, what the dimensions of the community are.
Yes, absolutely. It brings it to, for me, a more real construction of law. After all, nature moves according to its own laws. And we are also part of nature. I mean, our bodies were made up of the 5 elements, just like everything else. And so nature's laws bind us. our laws don't bind nature. Nature carries on irrespective of what human beings decide is the truth. So, given that nature's laws bind us, one would see that if nature didn't exist and thrive, we wouldn't exist and thrive as well. So, in that sense, everything that we call a human right derives from the rights of nature. If nature doesn't have a right to exist and thrive, how can we have a right to exist and thrive? Because our very existence is dependent upon nature. And so all it's doing really is just aligning, just expanding and evolving our laws to recognize that when we talk about community, we exist within a much wider community, and it's a community of all beings we share this planet with, and that's the plants, that's the mountains, the rivers. We are intrinsically interdependent, and it's just natural that if law is really going to meet the promise of the world that we would like to create for our children and our grandchildren, that it needs to expand its ambit and recognize all of the relationships that we have.
Mumta Ito, the young British lawyer who's determined to see the rights of nature recognized by the legal system of the European Union. In connection with our Green Rights Film Project, the Green Interview has lately been interviewing green lawyers from around the world. Cormac Cullinan in South Africa, for example, Pablo Fajardo in Ecuador, Michelle Maloney in Australia, Daniel Salaberry in Argentina. We'll be releasing these interviews throughout 2014. If they aren't yet posted when you see this, they soon will be. For the Green Interview and for the Green Rights Documentary Project, I'm Silver Donald Cameron.